Michelle Pfeiffer is in the middle of a career resurgence and stars in not one but two upcoming TV series, and she credits her husband, David E. Kelley, for supporting her. Michelle told Entertainment Tonight, "I think we both know that I've put in my time, and now it is my time."
For 37 years, two of Hollywood's most respected actors let a rumor sit in the room without ever touching it. Everyone in the industry seemed to know something had happened. Nobody with actual proof would say a word. And then, on an ordinary podcast recording in the fall of 2025, one of them finally opened the door, just a crack, and what came out reshaped a story that had been whispered about since 1988. To understand why this moment landed the way it did, you have to go back to the film that started it all. Dangerous Liaisons hit theaters in December of 1988, directed by Stephen Fraze and adapted from an 18th-century French novel about manipulation, seduction, and the games powerful people play with each other's hearts. The cast was stacked: Glenn Close as the icy, calculating Marquise de Merteuil, John Malkovich as the predatory Vicomte de Valmorne, and Michelle Pfeiffer as Madame de Tourvel, the virtuous married woman Valmorne sets out to destroy for sport. The film went on to earn 7 Academy Award nominations, and critics still cite it as one of the most quietly devastating period dramas ever made. What made it work wasn't just the writing or the costumes. It was the chemistry between Malkovich and Pfeiffer, a slow-burning, uncomfortable, almost unbearable tension that audiences could feel through the screen. Valmorne pursues. Tourvel resists. Tourvel breaks. It's a performance that requires two actors to spend months building something that looks, from the outside, indistinguishable from real intimacy. The production itself took place largely in the English countryside, away from the usual Hollywood machinery of publicists and studio minders, long stretches of time, isolated locations, and a story that was, quite literally, about the collapse of resistance in the face of calculated pursuit. And according to what we now know, in this case, the line didn't just blur. It disappeared entirely. It's worth pausing on just how strange that irony is. Here was a film built entirely around the mechanics of seduction, a predator methodically dismantling a virtuous woman's defenses for sport, only to find himself unexpectedly and genuinely undone by his own game. That's the plot of Dangerous Liaisons. It's also, according to the account we now have from one of its stars, something close to what happened behind the scenes. Art imitating life, or life imitating art, depending on which direction you think the causality ran. At the time, both actors had a great deal on the line. Pfeiffer was 30 years old and on the edge of the run that would define her career. Married to the Mob, The Fabulous Baker Boys, Batman Returns were all still ahead of her. She was married to television writer and producer Peter Horton, a relationship the two had entered in 1981. By outward appearances, it was one of the more low-drama pairings in Hollywood at the time. Malkovich, meanwhile, was already one of the most respected stage-to-screen actors of his generation, having picked up an Oscar nomination for Places in the Heart a few years earlier. He was married to actress Glenn Headley, someone he had met and fallen in love with through Chicago's Steppenwolf Theatre Company, the same ensemble that produced Gary Sinise and Joan Allen. Their marriage wasn't just a relationship. It was built on a shared artistic life that stretched back to their earliest years in the theater. Both of them, in other words, had something real to protect. And by the time Dangerous Liaisons wrapped, both marriages were unraveling. Headley and Malkovich split around 1988. Pfeiffer and Horton separated that same year, with their divorce finalized not long after. Two marriages, tied to the same production, dissolving in the same narrow window of time. Hollywood being Hollywood, the coincidence didn't stay quiet for long. For over 3 decades, that's where the story stayed, in that strange gray zone between persistent rumor and unconfirmed fact. Neither actor addressed it directly. Interviewers occasionally circled the topic and got nothing but deflection. Malkovich, at various points, gave lines that only fed the speculation without actually confirming anything, including one much-quoted remark where he said it was hard to believe Pfeiffer would ever have said hello to him in the first place. It was the kind of comment that sounded self-deprecating on the surface but read, to anyone paying attention, as an admission wrapped in a joke. Director Stephen Fraze added his own layer to the mystery years later, making public comments about how blurred the line between fiction and reality had become on that particular set, comments that were vague enough to avoid confirming anything directly, but specific enough to keep the rumor mill running for another decade. That's how these stories tend to survive in Hollywood. Nobody involved says enough to shut it down, and nobody involved says enough to confirm it either. It just sits there, gathering weight with every passing year, every unanswered question, every carefully worded non-denial. Meanwhile, journalists who covered the production at the time, along with crew members who'd been present for the months of filming, kept the story circulating through industry channels long before either actor addressed it publicly. That's often how these things work. The people closest to a production know far more than what eventually makes it into print, and what leaks out tends to arrive filtered, softened, and stripped of anything that could trigger a lawsuit. What's left is atmosphere, a persistent sense that something happened, without anyone willing to put their name on the specifics. Then, in September of 2025, something shifted. Malkovich sat down for an episode of the Fashion Neurosis podcast, hosted by Bella Freud, and for the first time in his career, he talked about it directly. He opened by acknowledging the obvious, that this was not a subject he'd ever really discussed publicly. From there, he described the nature of his work as an actor, explaining that emotional bonds form quickly in that profession, and that only rarely do those bonds extend beyond the work itself. It was a careful, almost clinical way of setting up what came next. He then turned to Pfeiffer specifically, describing her as someone he valued greatly as a colleague, someone he found genuinely fun to work with, and someone he called incredibly fair in their professional dealings, before adding, pointedly, that he himself hadn't always been. That last detail matters. It wasn't a throwaway compliment. It was Malkovich, in his own understated way, taking responsibility for something. The most revealing moment, though, came when he reflected on what happens when a working relationship crosses a line. He explained that what started as a deep friendship between them eventually crossed into something else, and once that happened, there was no going back. He said he realized in that moment just how rare a good colleague actually is, and that once a relationship becomes more than professional, more than friendly, you risk losing that colleague entirely. He even drew a contrast to another collaborator, actress Ingeborga Dapkunate, with whom he's worked since the early 1990s. 33 years of collaboration, still friends, still colleagues, because, in his words, there was a line they never crossed with each other. Read closely, that's about as direct as Malkovich has ever come to confirming what happened on that set. He didn't deny an affair. He didn't call it overblown tabloid fiction. He didn't offer the standard Hollywood line about just being close friends. Instead, he talked about the specific cost of what happened, the loss of a colleague, the rarity of what they'd had professionally, the regret of crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. It's not a tabloid confession. It's something quieter and, in a way, more convincing, a seasoned actor choosing his words with obvious precision, 37 years after the fact, and still measuring exactly how much to say. There's also something worth noting in the way he framed his own culpability. When he said Pfeiffer had been incredibly fair with him and added, almost as an aside, that he himself hadn't been, he was doing something actors of his generation rarely do in public, assigning himself the harder role in the story. Not the wronged party. Not the swept-away romantic. The one who didn't hold up his end of the fairness he was crediting her with. That's a small detail, easy to miss in a quick headline, but it's the kind of detail that tends to separate a calculated PR move from something closer to an honest reckoning. It also helps to understand the context in which he said it. The Fashion Neurosis podcast isn't a tabloid outlet chasing a scoop. It's a long-form conversation show known for drawing unusually candid, reflective answers out of guests who rarely give them anywhere else. That format matters. Malkovich wasn't cornered by a gossip reporter outside a restaurant. He was given space, time, and the kind of low-pressure setting that tends to produce more considered answers than a 5-minute junket interview ever could. Whatever he chose to say in that environment, he chose to say deliberately. Here's the part of the story that tends to get flattened in the retelling, though, and it's worth sitting with for a second. Michelle Pfeiffer has not said any of this. Not the podcast interview, not the reflections on regret, not the quotes about crossing lines. Every word attributed to this reckoning belongs to Malkovich. Pfeiffer, now in her late 60s, has maintained total public silence on the matter, not just recently, but for the entire 37 years since the rumors first started. She has never confirmed it. She has never denied it. She has never addressed it in any interview, on any podcast, in any context that's part of the public record. That silence is its own kind of statement, and it's worth taking seriously rather than reading past it. Pfeiffer has never been an actress who avoids hard conversations out of discomfort or a lack of self-possession. She's widely regarded as one of the more thoughtful and deliberate public figures of her generation, someone who gives interviews selectively and chooses exactly how much of her personal life to put on the record. Her decision to say nothing, decade after decade, appears to be exactly that, a decision, made and remade every time the subject resurfaces, to keep this one chapter entirely her own. Whether that reads as dignity, as strategy, or as something else entirely depends a lot on how you choose to interpret 37 years of a closed door. It's also worth being honest about what her past comments actually reveal, because they are often folded into this story in misleading ways. When Pfeiffer has spoken publicly about the end of her first marriage, she's talked about it in terms of youth and mismatched timing rather than any third party. She married Horton at 22, and in a 2012 interview she reflected that both of them were simply too young, that their needs changed as they grew up, and that despite the split they stayed close and never had an angry breakup. Notably, she's never once connected that account to Malkovich, to dangerous liaisons, or to any affair. That's a meaningful gap. The narrative that Pfeiffer has somehow confirmed this through implication doesn't hold up against what she's actually said, on the record, about her own marriage. What we do know is what happened to their lives afterward, and it's a study in two very different paths forward. Pfeiffer married television and film producer David E. Kelley in 1993, and the two have remained together ever since, raising two children together while keeping their family life notably out of the spotlight. Professionally, the years following Dangerous Liaisons produced the best-known stretch of her career, The Fabulous Baker Boys, which brought her a Golden Globe and an Oscar nomination, followed by Batman Returns, where her performance as Catwoman became genuinely iconic. She's continued working steadily since, including a run of high-profile roles in the Marvel Cinematic Universe in recent years. Malkovich, meanwhile, entered a long-term relationship with Nicoletta Peyran, with whom he has two children, and has spent much of his life since then based largely in Europe. Glenn Headley, his ex-wife, went on to build a strong career of her own, including a memorable turn in Dirty Rotten Scoundrels, before passing away in 2017. According to reporting from the time, their split was a genuinely difficult one. Headley was said to have once referred to her ex-husband as the root of all evil, a line sharp enough that it followed Malkovich around in profiles for years afterward, even as he later suggested it had been meant more ironically than it read on the page. Malkovich's own career took an unmistakably idiosyncratic path in the years after the split, from the tension of In the Line of Fire to the surreal self-parody of Being John Malkovich, a film that turned the very strangeness of being him into the entire premise, and onward into a body of international work that never quite settled into a predictable lane. His continued acting steadily into his 70s, taking on roles that range from prestige drama to gleeful character actor detours, seemingly unbothered by typecasting or any single defining image of who is supposed to be on screen. So why does a decades-old rumor about two actors on a period drama still matter enough to make headlines in 2025 and 2026? Part of it is simply about the nature of acting itself. The job asks performers to manufacture intimacy on command, to love, grieve, desire, and surrender in front of a camera, night after night, until the emotional muscle memory becomes real regardless of the script. It shouldn't shock anyone that occasionally those emotions don't stay contained to the set. And part of it is about what long silence costs, and what it protects. Pfeiffer chose total silence and has held that line without a single public crack for nearly 4 decades. Malkovich chose something else, occasional, oblique acknowledgement that finally, in 2025, turned into something close to an actual account of what happened. Tellingly, even in that rare moment of candor, what he expressed wasn't a tell-all about the romance itself. It was regret over losing a colleague he clearly still respects. That's really the shape of this story, when you strip away the tabloid framing. 2 marriages ended around the same production. One person has spent 37 years saying absolutely nothing about it. The other finally said something, not everything, but something, and chose to frame it not as scandal, but as loss. 2 careers that not only survived the fallout but flourished well beyond it. And a story that, even now, is only half told, because the person whose side of it might matter most has never once agreed to tell it. What do you make of Malkovich's comments? Does hearing his side change how you think about a rumor that's followed both of them for nearly 4 decades? Drop your take in the comments, and if you want more deep dives into the stories,